Welcome back to the Fire Break. I'm Steve Wolf. As you know, the Fire Break is sponsored by Team Wildfire. When I say sponsored, I mean they bought all the equipment that we're playing with and the cameras and all the other stuff that begrudgingly funded, but funded nonetheless. Thank you, team, for putting up with me on that. Team Wildfire, as you know, is dedicated towards finding new ways to reduce firefighter fatalities and property loss from wildfires. So now that I got that out of the way, we could jump into the real meat of today's topic, which is that we're going to be hanging out with Teal Brown Zimring. And Teal is the executive director. And for those of you who don't know, if you see the word executive director, it basically means CEO, but for a nonprofit organization. And the program that Teal runs is called Lab to Land. So that's intriguing in itself. And if you were just browsing through LinkedIn, as I admit that I do spend quite a bit of time doing, and you saw Lab to Land, you might wonder, what is that? It's like sounds some kind of variant of farm to table or something. Teal, welcome to the Fire Break. How are you today?
Thank you so much, Steve. I'm great. Thanks. How are you? Pleasure to be here.
I am. Well, you know how I am. I'm consistent. And you look like you're having a good day too. So let's jump right in. What is Lab to Land? And is that your main focus these days? Because if it's not, we're going to talk about something else.
It is my main focus these days, although there are other things that that I am also thinking about and doing. But it's relevant to the issue, and it is certainly
Okay.
something I'm spending a lot of time on. The Lab to Land Institute is a nonprofit organization that is focused on understanding and unlocking the potential of biotechnologies to deliver environmental value, with a particular focus on critically threatened ecosystem services. So we are largely focused in California. And the reason we jumped into this space is because there is a really substantial global growth in what is called the bioeconomy, which we can talk about. And also there are incredible value adds that biotechnology can offer to critically threatened ecosystems and ecosystem services. And also, it is a stymied space for good reasons that relate to sociocultural, political, economic, and technology readiness concerns. So, our thought is not that we should necessarily be applying biotechnology solutions to land, but rather that we should be using this piece of human ingenuity to research and understand and enable land management, both natural and working land strategies that are effective and efficient, particularly in the face of a changing climate, and ethical. And we shouldn't miss the opportunity to look and to consider and to do the early research that helps us more fully understand that potential. So that's Lab to Land.
Wow. Well, I would say based on the answer you gave me, I must look a lot smarter than I am. But I thank you for, I thank you for the credit that I understood what you're saying, some of which I did. Um, at a junior level, so I don't have to think too hard. Not that I object to it, but I run out of brain steam at some point.
It's nice not to have to.
What does that mean at a practical level? Like, what does the organization do,
Mm-hmm.
and what do you do in the organization?
Yeah.
So you talked about bio something, and break it down for me.
Sure. Biotechnology broadly is quite simply the use of genomic sciences, which means the ability to understand biology and its genomes and what's happening inside a cell and in biology, and to take
Okay.
that knowledge and
Okay.
that type of science and apply it to challenges. So at the simplest level, it means
Apply it to what? To calendars?
challenges, environmental
Oh, to
challenges.
challenges. Okay. I'm
Yeah.
sorry. All right.
Yeah,
Okay.
so at the simplest level, we're really just saying, let's use biological sciences and consider
Yep.
environmental challenges. And that could mean a
Okay.
whole huge variety of things. But that I would say is kind of the simplest framing of, what is biotechnology, and we can talk more about that. But biological sciences, environmental challenges, and what we do as an organization is three things: convening, research, and technology transfer. And what we very specifically do within each of those is that in the convening function, I think of it almost as problem defining, working with
Okay.
stakeholders such as land stewards, regulators, land managers, scientists, a whole diversity of individuals that have a stake in a threatened ecosystem, and working with them to understand the problems they're seeing, the challenges they're confronting, and then to just simply imagine what might be the potential of these scientific tools to assist in those challenges.
Okay.
Under the research function, we fund postdoctoral students to actually pursue early stage research where we think there is something that is potentially ethical, efficient, and viable for real value. And that does include social and hard sciences. So sometimes we fund, we have a fellowship where we actually specifically fund anthropologists, cultural anthropologists, to look at how, when, why, whether we should be using advanced sciences to address ecosystem challenges. And then we also fund hard scientists to look in lab and maybe, for example, sequence the genome of a soil microbiome to understand what's happening in it. For example, after we drop a lot of phosphorus on it when we fight a fire, what's actually happening? What are the
Right.
long-term impacts? Under the tech transfer function, that's a little bit of a misnomer for some in the world. We don't actually spin out companies or transfer into applied outcomes through sort of an accelerator or a venture program, if you know these terms, but rather we assist with early stage field testing where that's possible. Maybe we help with finding permits, or we help in building the relationships that just allow something to move from lab into an early field trial where that is an appropriate next step. And that's the full extent of our relationship as an organization. The idea being one way to move forward early stage science in the biological sciences for environmental outcomes is to define problems that people want to solve first, and then go into the lab
Okay.
and look at the research.
I see. So you
High,
would look at a big problem such as wildfires,
for
and you'd
example.
say, is it possible that there could be some nature-based solutions, or could there be some genomic research here, or could we genetically modify trees so that they didn't burn, or could we spread different types of mushrooms on the forest floor to eat up the dead wood and turn it into dirt so that we didn't have to go in there, with a 1920s government works project of humping wood out of the forest. Um, so would it be stuff like that, or is that too simplistic?
Those are all good examples. Some of them are, on the, I would say, much more wild side of what, yes, is scientifically feasible, but maybe not reasonable, appropriate, ethical, or necessary. For example, editing a tree to be less flammable. But I think those are all good examples. And the way that I might think about it is that the capacities of biological sciences include a deep understanding. And this is what we talk about sequencing the genome as another way of understanding what's happening. Sometimes we call this eDNA, environmental DNA. So building our toolkit as to what we see is happening now, and then over time what the changes are. Another capacity that these sciences have is to, like you said, create novel functions. So that is indeed possible. I'm not sure I would recommend it in most or many circumstances, but it is indeed possible. And so those are kind of two broad categories of what we might consider when looking at a challenge. So yes, those are all good examples, and I could provide more.
I would love to hear more. And I'd also know, you had an ethics based response to some of my questions, and I wanted to
Mm,
find out. So we'll come back to the more in a second. Um, how do you go about parsing out the ethical issues here?
yeah.
I mean, is it something that, like, if Teal feels good about it, it's ethical, and if you object to it, it's not? Or is there like an ethics committee that has some criteria that they go through? And I'm not saying that those wouldn't be equally good methods.
Yeah, thank you. Uh, Both and more. So we do have a environmental biotechnology council, which includes several bioethicists and also ethicists. There are people who define themselves as bioethicists, meaning biological sciences and environmental space ethics, and then also just ethics in general, and those can be different fields. And we consult with and have a council that specifically grapples not just with questions of uh, broadly speaking, what might be some parameters that could define an ethical approach. But we also actually bring priorities that we think might be interesting into that council for them to grapple with specific and precise approaches as we think about what research is needed. And sometimes what comes out of that is the research that is needed is a deeper understanding of what ethics is, or a methodology that could deliver greater clarity on the things that have been considered or should be considered to have a quote unquote definition of ethics. So sometimes the research that is recommended is in fact not go into the lab and sequence the genomes of the microbiome of the soil, for example, but rather go think about what all the alternatives are, what we mean when we say bioethics, and come up with a more robust methodology for this precise setting. So that's, I would say, kind of some of the methods we use to think about it. Another thing that's maybe helpful to think about is we're kind of interested in the intersection of, I might describe it as a Venn diagram. So the intersection of socioculturally and politically feasible, and we can talk about what that means, technologically possible on a relevant timescale to the problem, and climate critical. And so, what is it that might fall in that space? That is research that we think is worth in
Mm,
lab early work. And while it's developing in lab, you have to continue to consider, is there a pathway to applied outcomes? Should there be? What are the ramifications and parameters? What do we need to make sure is slowing down or speeding up? So, lab time is long. So, you have a lot of opportunity to learn and build knowledge base and contribute to the growth of general scientific knowledge while you are still considering what may or may not be a pathway forward that can really contribute to a challenge. And if that's too esoteric, I can provide
okay.
a kind of applied
No, that's
example
okay.
we think.
No, you talked about measuring the impact of phosphorus on trees, let's say, once we've dropped retardant on them, or fire suppressants.
Yeah.
How does that impact them? Uh, when they test the chemicals that they drop on the forests, one of the tests that they go through is fish kill. Right? How many fish will this kill?
Hmm.
I'm assuming that there's no fish who volunteer for that experiment. Just when you talk ethics, um,
Yeah.
speak to that. The fish toxicity test that is required in order to get onto the qualified products list for using your products on federal fires.
Steve, that's
So,
a great.
what the people say, you know what, we're going to kill some fish, and that'll tell us whether this product is safe. And because these fish died, that'll save way more fish from dying in the future. So, is this the trolley thing?
I definitely see where you're getting at with the full scope of the question. It's a great question. I want to caveat it a little in that I don't I don't know that much about sort of how is that test conducted, or what are the other surrounding parameters that are required for getting on the approved products list that interrelate with with that particular metric. So I can't speak to kind of that particular metric. However, um, I do think that there are, in fact, what do I want to say? a couple opportunities that come to my mind when we ask that question. One is,
Okay.
are there ways of getting at the same metrics that that don't require us to know how many fish might be killed? For example, biological sciences can play out a lot of models for us that actually would simplify and be potentially more ethical, depending how some of those tests are conducted. And this is a good example of where, how do I want to phrase this? The corollary that's coming to my mind is actually outside the fire space, which
Okay.
is, for example, right now we're experiencing kelp forest loss at really substantial rates all over the coasts of
Yes.
California. There are a few reasons for that. One is that urchin populations have exploded, and there's reasons for that. And then how do we go about addressing that? Well, in many cases, what we do is we go out and we gather up the sea urchins and we smash them. So that's the status quo. So then when we talk about
Right.
the
And they do
ethics,
research on that in Italy, I think. Yeah.
oh, really? In Italy?
Yeah. There's a book about it. It's called The Urchin of Venice. You'll have
Oh,
to check it out.
really? That's a great title. I
No,
love that.
it's for Italian kelp researchers. Right?
Exactly. Anyway, I think my point only is that when you think about, what does ethics mean in the context of these tests, and what are we looking for, and what are the alternatives? Sometimes what we're doing today is in fact worse than what the potential might be if we were willing to consider new and advanced scientific approaches that could actually mitigate the need for things that are currently practiced today, which are possibly far less ethical to the other species in that equation. So I don't know if that really answered your
Yeah.
question.
And I think that
Yeah, go ahead.
I'll have to think about it more, honestly. Because as humans, we want to solve the problems for humans first. And if anybody else benefits, great. And then if other species suffer, sorry.
Right.
But for some people, when they look at at a wildfire, especially when it occurs in areas where there's minimal human impact, there's never minor impact on the species that live there.
Right.
However, given that wildfire predates humans, we don't necessarily have to take responsibility for all the fire-related deaths of our kindred species. Those deaths happened long before we were here and long after. Although it's probably magnified because we've changed conditions on the earth so that there is more fire. But if you ever visited a place where there was a wildfire and you come back, a year later, 2 years later, it's just rife with life. New things are growing on in the ground, and new little critters are coming to eat it, and the whole ecosystem springs up all over again. So we might overthink our role in this in terms of our impact on our brethren species. They just like us, every species has its day on Earth, and who knows. I can't think of a species that is doing more to expedite its own decline than humans. Hopefully, we don't take too many other species with us along the way.
Yeah, I agree with much of what you said, and also I think a few things are true. One is, and my guess is that you wouldn't disagree with this, but one is, it's never black and white, right? It's never, it is our responsibility or it is not, right? There are gray spaces in basically every choice we make and how we show up. And then another is that we are so far stepped in to our impacts in this world. We are so substantially a part of how almost every ecosystem on the planet is now functioning, that there is quite arguably a responsibility to participate in what it is that we do with whether it's critically threatened ecosystems, or ecosystem services upon which we rely, or climate threats like wildfire or extreme storms, or some of the things we're seeing on the horizon. I wouldn't disagree with the point that we don't have to take emotional and personal responsibility for the impact on necessarily every species in every scenario. But I do think that our footprint on the land is so substantial that it's no longer, then this is kind of what Elizabeth Kotler says, it's no longer a question of what is and what was, and looking back to a time where we say let's take our hands off the scenario and let the system just do what the system's going to do, but rather what is and what will be, and what is it that we should be investing in and researching and seeking a deeper understanding of, so that we have, at least to the best of our ability, provided some responsible alternatives for the future that we have so substantially contributed to.
So this is when I was little and I was cranky, I'm not saying I'm not still occasionally cranky, but particularly when I was a smaller child, my dad would come in and he would say, "What is it that you would like to have happen now?" And that would kind of end any conversation about what had led up to it or causation, right? It's like, okay, let's look forward. What does that look like, and what can we do about that? So, what are you looking forward to moving forward? Because it unfortunately it shouldn't, but it does get politically contentious if we look back, as scientists are apt to do, and say what got us here, based on the idea that if we understand what got us here, that could help us get out. But let's say we had to turn our back on that for a moment and just say, okay, well, here's where we are. What can we do going forward? And so where do you come down on that? What are the things that you think are most important if we're going to minimize our impact? You called it a footprint. I think I might call it an air print, because what we're doing to the air seems to be causative in what's happening on the ground, right? That we pollute the air, or we create more greenhouse gases, like we're warming the planet, and we're doing that from the air in. So what have you seen that looks promising, that you're excited about, that falls in your wheelhouse, that you say, this area of technology really seems to be holding promise for us to stop screwing up our planet or burning it up so badly? What comes to mind for you?
Yeah, well, first of all, I like the air print. That's compelling, and fun to think about that way. I like that. And then if I might kind of parse the question, at least my mind went to two things. One, that first question of a little bit what needs to be done now, and then two, where are there technologies or areas of innovation or work that seem to hold promise for that. And I think on the first part, in terms of, all right, if it's not about what was, but what do we do now? My perspective is that we need to be looking at regional, what some might call sort of subscale demonstration projects that work hand in hand with all of the stakeholders who are a part of the problem and the solution, who are experiencing it from any angle. And through that, de-risk policy change, tell important stories, work hand in hand with regions and their regional market economics. So building business models for demonstration projects that are solutions to challenges. And this is, I'll get to fire here, so that we can be contributing the critical data that is needed, the critical stories that are needed. Because at a global scale, there's so much conversation about carbon when we talk about innovation and technology, what's going to drive it. There's this, what I would say, sort of race to commodify the externalities of what we do, meaning race to get to the perfect price on carbon, race to get to the perfect price on biodiversity, race to get to like markets as a goal, not markets as a tool. And the way we're going to get there, I think, in a real meaningful way, is that right now is our moment to be doing things that take advantage of regional economics, regional stakeholders, regional challenges, and do things that through that storytelling, through that visible work, can de-risk lawmakers showing up and saying, oh, okay, I see, the community does get it and they want it. And this is where, to my mind, fire is so important and compelling and worth noting. It's also a lot of my background prior to coming into the biotechnology space is as a political economist who has looked specifically at fire for and with the state of California. And also, it's so relevant to this challenge of what do we do now? How do we think about innovation now? Because fire is the intersection of a climate critical challenge, a place where sociopolitical will is increasing as San Francisco's skies turn orange, as PG&E creates rolling brownouts that cause massive economic ramifications, as rural communities breathe smoke and children are sent home from public schools because it is not safe in our public infrastructure at those smoke levels. With these things happening, we start to see sociopolitical will and even economics showing up from the state. Where can we build funds that will drive innovation that will help solve this problem? So we've got a climate critical challenge. We've got people saying, okay, I'm ready to really think creatively about how to show up in this space in a solution-oriented way. And we've got rural communities with regional economic challenges and opportunities that provide very real places for solutions to advance and to tell really important stories. And so is this the perfect intersection for biotechnology? No, not necessarily, although I think there are some opportunities. But it is a great space to start doing demonstration work that can help us think differently about what innovation means and not just aim for global scale or carbon markets to pay our way into a set of innovations that will drive real change. So to the first question, what do I think needs to be done now? I think we need to find those geographies on the planet where that intersection is a reality, climate critical, some socio-political or economic will, and some technologies that are ready to show up. And we need to do the stakeholder engaged local work to do things in those places. And that should feed into kind of global market stories that help us think at a different scale. So that's what I think needs to be done now. And then to the second question of where am I seeing some promise or where might some things be already doing this or possibly moving forward. And there's probably a whole suite of examples, and I'd be curious to hear yours as well. Sticking with the fire space, I think there are some opportunities for things like, this isn't the best solution from a climate perspective, but it's one that can move in the nearer term. So things like rural district scale heating, biomass to pyrolysis for regional backup energy grids. These types of things are already happening today and probably will happen at greater scale as we see different types of investments and policy change over time.
Wow. Wow. So I mean, that's a lot to get excited about. And so the scope of our show really is on the pyrolysis part of it. What's going on in fire? Are you seeing anything promising right now at the intersection of bio and fire remediation?
Yeah. Gosh, there has long been, and maybe you've had other folks speak about this, or I think you yourself may have some background here around sort of waste to value campus models for the use of what is often termed high hazard fuel or the byproduct of ecological thinning. So through reducing the risk of mega fire in forests, we have these sort of branches and small diameter timber that come out of the forest. We can talk more about the challenges and opportunities that live in that space. But one of the challenges is that they can be there's not a lot of willingness to pay for that material because the products it creates, coupled with the cost of making those products, tend to not create
Right.
really great market economics. But there's some work up in the Sierra Nevada. There's a couple different places that already have out in Quincy and are working on out in Tahoe some sort of different models where they're creating multiple products on the same campus that use the waste of one to create the value for the next, and the waste of that to create the value for the next. And so those are, I think, providing both meaningful value in terms of whether it's energy or structural wood products into their markets, and they are also providing at least some economic value that encourages the ecological thinning to happen on a timescale that is at least closer to preferable. So there's some
Okay.
things
So
there.
Teal, just for people who don't know about the thinning,
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
sorry.
No, go ahead.
Yeah. So basically, like we go in and we cut the trees down, and the best monetary use of trees is to make lumber, but that also leaves the branches that got trimmed off before we sent the lumber to processing, and other things that can burn that are just laying on the ground because they don't really have much economic value. So the question is like, can we could we make toilet paper and paper towels out of that stuff just as much as we could from the sawdust that comes out of the mills? Um, and if we could increase the value of those products, then there would be an economic incentive to go in and harvest them, and then the forest floors would be cleaner, and there'd be less, ground-based spread of fire, right? So, is that kind of the direction you're thinking on that?
Yeah, by and large, a lot of times for the ecological thinning prescriptions. So prescription is a word that I'll just take the Forest Service as an example, might use when they look at a landscape and they say, okay, our prescription for that part is that it's ready to receive beneficial fire. We don't need to go in and remove anything before it can receive beneficial fire. And our prescription over here for this part is that this stuff has to come out in order for this landscape to receive prescribed or beneficial fire. So there's these different prescriptions. And sometimes a prescription will result in things where the value is lumber, like you said. And then sometimes the things that come out of an ecological thinning project, where things are taken out, sort of high hazard fuels, will be almost entirely non-merchantable. Very little lumber will be made from it. And then it'll be piled. And then there's some policy challenges, which include, can you get that pile onto a truck? Well, that requires a road and a truck that uses diesel, and then that costs
Right.
money, and then they got to take it somewhere, and that's more diesel, et cetera, et cetera. So these are the economics you were alluding to, yeah.
Yes.
And
So
sometimes
it's
it just gets left out there.
as always the answer. I Yeah, I think that as always the best answer is, well, it's complicated.
Yeah, right. Exactly. It's
Right.
complicated.
Right. That it's seldom as it seems, and sometimes things that look like the obvious solution are not going to happen, and they're actually bad. And if we were to try to, pelletize all that waste so that people could burn it in their stoves, is that not just slowly creating just as much pollution as burning the trees down all at once? So you end up, and I'm sure this is an area where you have a lot of experience in seeing unintended consequences. Is that your favorite book?
Yeah, although
And I'm not referring to the actual book, because there is a book called that, but
the theoretical book of unintended consequences.
yes.
Yes, and also I think we need to be creative, and there's an organization that ran a convening for several years. They may still called Intended Consequences, to help us think about being a little more creative with the considerations we take on in the spirit of almost just brainstorming. to imagine what is possible and not limit ourselves for fear of the unintended consequences. But that's sort of a philosophical aside. Yes.
But
Yes.
that's that comes back to what you were talking about de-risking. That about political de-risking, right? If I do something bold and different that might create a different solution, oh, there's a chance it might not go well, and then what's going to happen to my campaign, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, and the same thing, right? So, we're a startup business, and when we talk to our business advisors, they're also, well, what are you doing to de-risk your business? Well, we're out doing it, and if we succeed, then I guess the risk was lower than we thought, or we were really lucky, or we've lowered the risk somehow. But there seems to be this big push, whether in government or in privately funded ventures, for de-risking, and I'm not sure that that's the most constructive thing, because you have to take big risks and you have to develop an appetite for risk if you want to get any different outcomes than the ones we're getting now.
Steve, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, just so much. Where my mind goes with that is two things. One, you mentioned earlier the trolley problem. This is really
Yes.
where we have focused with Lab to Land Institute, is that we won't understand the risk if we don't invest in the early stage research. And if we're not willing to invest in the early stage research because we don't understand the risk, what we will do is sit in the back of the bus and watch some of our most innovative sciences pass us by without examining the potential. And so we both need to acknowledge the need to limit risk and aim for positive outcomes, and also find the pathways to move capital toward the ideas where we think the risk may be worth the reward. And so that's very much, I couldn't agree with you more on that front.
Well, I think that's really an area where you see a, a splitting between the way things work in academia and the way things work in business.
Yeah.
And one would hope that the purpose of academia is to go down some dead end roads, so that we know that that's not the right road.
Mm-hmm.
To de-risk on an academic budget things that we don't want to go down on a financial budget for a company, right? That we know, okay, well, the university went down these roads, they didn't pan out. We can now eliminate those as directions that we want to take for commercial ventures, and I see that partly as the responsibility of a university. Figure out all the ways we can fail, not just focus on how can we succeed.